Welcome, everyone. Sorry for the minor delay. Thank you for joining us today. We're very delighted to be joined by Dr. Vincent Intondi, a professor of history and director of the Institute for Race, Justice, and Civic Engagement at Montgomery College in Takoma Park, Maryland, and the author of The African Americans Against the Bomb and Saving the World from Nuclear War books. We highly recommend both of these for those looking to understand the nuclear disarmament movement's history and current state of play. And I believe we have some promotional links related to those books that we'll drop in the chat. And for those who aren't familiar with us at Good Energy Collective, we're a policy research organization building the progressive case for nuclear energy as an essential part of the broader climate change agenda, while working to align the clean energy space with environmental justice and sustainability goals. To be clear, supporting nuclear energy absolutely does not equate to endorsing or condoning the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We recognize the importance of robust non-proliferation efforts, disarmament agreements, and arms control measures to ensure global security. And our advocacy for nuclear energy is rooted in a vision of a sustainable, equitable future. So today we invited Dr. Intondi specifically to discuss the historical origins of the nuclear disarmament movement, the intersection between race and nuclear weapons, and the foundational role that civil rights movement activists played in early disarmament efforts. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Intondi.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's just start off with our first question. Now, how did you become interested in the nuclear disarmament movement, and how did that result in your two books?
Thank you. And if there was any glitches, that's my fault to anybody that is on this webinar. I apologize. So a couple of things. One is I grew up in Syracuse, New York, which is in upstate New York, and there was kind of a lot of things that kind of coalesced around that growing up. So one is we in Syracuse, New York, are home to the Cayuga Nation, the Oneida Nation, the Onondaga Nation, and I spent a lot of time on the Onondaga Nation just having friends. So I was kind of surrounded by that Native American culture in some ways. And at the same time, not far from where I lived was the 9 Mile 2 power plant. And then the third thing was Lockheed Martin for so many years still is, I believe, the main employer in that city, which builds nuclear weapons. So you kind of had all these things coming together. But most of my work as an academic and as an activist revolved around the Black freedom movement and around civil rights issues. So nuclear weapons, like many younger kids, wasn't really on my radar. They seemed very abstract. They seemed, I didn't really know much about them. Nobody would be crazy enough to use them. But that fundamentally changed for me the first time I went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I went there as a student and met with atomic bomb survivors and went to museums and ceremonies. And when I learned about what my country had done, I was filled with so much kind of rage and guilt and anger that when I came back from that first trip, I've been there so many times since, I thought to myself, okay, what can I do to eliminate racism and eliminate nuclear weapons, these two things that I am so passionate about? And so I just started with the question of what did African Americans think about using the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And that's what started the research. That's what started me down this path. And quite frankly, I did not know what I was going to find. A lot of people told me I wasn't going to find much, that African Americans were too busy trying to gain their own freedom and equality and didn't have time to really get into this issue. And they were wrong. What I ended up finding was that African Americans were deeply entrenched in this issue all the way as early as 1945 when the bomb was dropped. And that, race and nuclear weapons in many ways were inextricably linked. And that's what kind of started me down this path of research.
Okay, great, awesome. That's really interesting how you sort of came to this work and how that sort of resulted in your two books. Could you give us a brief overview of the current state of nuclear disarmament?
So nuclear disarmament has, in some ways, I think over the last bunch of years, taken a backseat to climate change, which is understandable because climate change is much more tangible. For a lot of younger students, they can see the fires, they can see the weather, they can see what's happening as a direct result of climate change and fossil fuels. And so they can also do something to provide agency to these students. They can go after, Keystone Pipeline and Standing Rock and things like that. That's tangible, right? It's harder to do with nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, you start talking about ICBMs and no first use and, sole authority and things like that. Kids, a lot of younger folks, their eyes just gloss over. And so it's how do you make that digestible? How do you make it so that you make it plain, right? How do you make it so that you don't need a physics degree to really understand this stuff and provide that agency? And so what we have seen over the last couple of years is when Trump got elected, we started to see a concern about nuclear weapons in a way we haven't in a long time, because he talked so much about using nuclear weapons. And then people started looking at his attitudes and his bluster and said, okay, for the first time, people were realizing that we have the system in our country is that the president of the United States has the sole authority to launch nuclear weapons without having no checks and balances. They don't need to check with the military, with Congress, with anybody. And so for the first time, people started thinking about that in North Korea. And now you add in what's happening with obviously with Putin, and then you really started to see again this kind of heightened awareness of all things nuclear. And so we're seeing more of it now of this kind of concern. And I think in terms of nuclear disarmament, the cornerstone of nuclear disarmament has always been the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, signed in 1968. But one of the keys to that is the piece that says that nuclear powers will work towards disarmament, and we're not seeing that. And in fact, we're seeing the opposite. And so, if I had to put my kind of eggs in one basket as far as disarmament goes, it would be the TPNW, which is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That was passed in 2017 and then went into force a couple of years later, was signed by over 120 nations, most of them from the global south, and then ratified. And I look at the kind of the NPT as being the cornerstone of building any house. I look at the TPNW as being the capstone. And there's a lot of floors that we got to build in between, but that is the ultimate piece is the TPNW. And so that's where I see kind of the future going and where we need to be in terms of eliminating nuclear weapons. But it is a dangerous time right now because what we are seeing is a real struggle to find money for the nuclear disarmament movement, like with a lot of NGOs. And what we're seeing is China rising, building more nuclear weapons, the US modernizing and spending trillions of dollars on nuclear weapons. You have Russia now saying they're going to put nuclear weapons in Belarus. And so it is getting more and more dangerous. So it's important more now than in some ways since the Cuban Missile Crisis to get involved in something like this.
Yeah. Thank you for that overview. In your books, you sort of take a historical kind of look at the nuclear disarmament movement to basically inform your current understanding and where you think we should go in the future. So in your book, Saving the World from Nuclear War, the focal point is the June 12th disarmament rally, dubbed the Disarmament Rally to End All Disarmament Rallies. How do you think this rally contributes to your understanding of nuclear disarmament's historical progression and current standing?
Thank you. Yeah. So the reason I wrote that book is, and it just came out in March. The reason I wrote it is because when I was seeing all of this heightened awareness of all things nuclear with Trump and with Russia and things like that, what I wasn't seeing was, I started looking at, can you organize around fear? And I came to the conclusion that yes, you can, as long as you're providing the hope. And the hope was missing. And that's part of why I wanted to look at this, because this was the largest single rally in United States history, the largest peace rally, arguably, in the world, in terms of having, in 1982, over 1 million people in the streets of New York, in Central Park, demanding an end to the nuclear arms race. And it came on with the Nuclear Freeze Initiative, which you could argue was the greatest citizen-led mobilization in U.S. history. And it actually did move the needle on Reagan's thinking. And so what I wanted to show with this, by going back and interviewing a lot of the folks that were organizing this and were involved in this, were a couple of things. I wanted to show, one, that the nuclear disarmament movement has always been more diverse than previously talked about. And just like with my first book, African Americans Against the Bomb, when you look at this rally in particular, and you look at the 1980s, kind of the height of the anti-nuclear movement, you will see that it was led by people of color. It was led by the LGBTQ community. It was led by women. It was led by not just middle-class white men. That's not true. These voices have just been ignored for so long in this movement and in this history. The second thing I wanted to show was that a lot of the same problems that organizers have in different social movements today are not new. So, for example, homophobia and racism and patriarchy, misogyny, these things are not new. They were going on back then. And so, to show younger organizers today, how did these folks navigate that terrain? How did they go through all these things? And how did they put 1 million people in the streets without a cell phone, without email, without any social media? And yet they did it. And then, thirdly, I wanted to show that grassroots activism actually can work, because when you went back, while at the time the Reagan administration was saying it had they could care less about any of this. Years later, many Reagan officials, including the first lady, said, oh, yes, we were very much aware of what was happening. And it was in part why we ended up with the INF treaty. And so the other thing is that, again, I think agency is so important in that when you bring so many people together like that, and then tell them, like, this is what you can do after you leave the protest, after you leave the rally, is incredibly important. Showing how they were able, again, to make it plain and make it in understandable language is something that we can learn about, from today. So it was just, how do I, I'm always in both books trying to thread the needle between an academic audience, something that can be assigned in classes for, undergraduates, but then also for a mainstream audience and people that aren't, have all of these advanced degrees and and are in the weeds in the way some of us are, that they were able to learn from this as well. And so that was some of the things that I wanted to show as a result of, of this book, what actually has been done in the past, because I also think too is, that this is a long movement, right? They're not compartmentalized. And just like in the Black freedom movement, right? Without the Nat Turners, the Gabriel Prosners of the world, the Denmark Veseys of the world, you don't get a Harlem Renaissance. You don't get a Marcus Garvey. And without a Marcus Garvey, you don't get a Malcolm X. Without a Malcolm X, you don't get a President Obama. It is a long continuum. And it's the same thing here. Without those that were working in the 1940s and then in the 1950s, without performing artists for nuclear disarmament and dancers for disarmament and artists and so on and so forth, you don't get to the TPNW where we're at today. So it is a long continuum, and that's the importance, is kind of to look back and see, okay, how can we move forward? What can we learn from that history? I'm not somebody that thinks you should just, as a historian, look at history and leave it in the past. That makes no sense to me. What are we going to do? What can we learn from it to apply to it today? And that's what I wanted to hopefully show.
Yeah, yeah, it's great. And I think you definitely did in both books. So in your answer, you mentioned sort of the messaging and optics aspects of rallying public support in the run-up to the disarmament rally after President Reagan's election. Even though the nuclear citizen freeze messaging was tailored to align with white mainstream perspectives, the rally's leadership and messaging saw substantial involvement and impact from African Americans and other people of color. What essential insights should activists and political leaders take away from this?
Well, when we look at the intersection of race and nuclear weapons, it is, in most cases, it's so often of people of color who are the biggest victims of this, right? So we can look at let's start with the production of nuclear weapons, right? The production of nuclear weapons, whether it be at Hanford, whether it was at the Savannah River Project, Oak Ridge, African Americans were historically, and Mexican Americans were historically the ones that were being brought in to clean up the nuclear spills, to clean up all these places, and they were never given equipment. So they were filled with cancer. They were never given proper equipment. They were never given any kind of health care. And in fact, they were segregated from their white counterparts. And it was so nasty, it was so bad that the areas where African Americans were being housed during the Manhattan Project were actually called coon areas, and for whites to stay away from those areas in terms of violence, and then also for health reasons. So with the production, we see that. Now, if we look at where the uranium mining has happened, well, the uranium mining is often happening on Native American lands. It is also happening in the Congo, right? So the Belgian-controlled Congo. So again, we see the colonialism, we see people of color and where that affects and how the bombs are being, created. When we look at where bombs were being obviously dropped on people of color in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but where have they also been threatened to be used? In Vietnam, in Korea, in the Middle East, right? We have threatened. When we look at nuclear testing, not just us, right? We've tested on Native American lands. We have tested in the Marshall Islands. If you start looking at French Polynesia, if you look at Kazakhstan where nuclear weapons were tested, if you look at Australian Aborigines, if you look at, where did the French test their first nuclear weapon? In Africa, in the Sahara, which merely made Kwame Nkrumah rise up and become a big anti-nuclear activist. So we see over and over again that nuclear testing is happening on people of color. When we look at even, we just had Memorial Day, there were a number of atomic veterans who were African American, who were told when they came back from World War II, they were sent out to Nevada and they were used as guinea pigs to test nuclear weapons out with. So we see this throughout. Now, when we look at the money being spent, and this is really where in the 1980s people of color got involved, because what they see is here we are spending all of this money, at that time billions, now it's trillions of dollars on nuclear weapons, and it's at the expense of cutting all of these social programs that mostly benefit the poor, and in many cases Black communities. So they're saying here's this economic conversion piece as well. So all of these types of things, is it passive indifference? Is it that we just don't care about these people? Or is it active malice that we really, the racism is so there that we want to eliminate these people? But either way, we see a people of color always being, the victims here in terms of this. And it just goes back to creating an other, right? If it goes back to slavery for the United States, that when we say that, that African people are less than human, when they are subhuman, when we put it in our Constitution and say they are 3/5 of a human being, they are unchristian, they are not civilized, they are biologically inferior. Well, those are the justifications for the economic system and to treat Africans the way we're treating them for all of this money, right? And so we do the same thing with Native Americans, right? When we look at the sports teams, and we look at how we are portraying them, we do the same thing with people in the Middle East, right? What are the images that they show us? The most bombastic image they can show us: somebody screaming Allah Akbar, and they don't look like us or talk like us or smell like us or act like us. So the translation is they're not really one of us, right? When we make that jump and we say that people of Latin American descent are not brothers and sisters and sons and daughters, no, they're aliens. Well, then they're not fully human. So it makes it, again, easier to say that we should just put them in cages and so on and so forth. We did the same thing with the Japanese after Pearl Harbor, the same thing with the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. So when we take people, a group of people, make them less than human, it makes it easier to commit violence against them. And in this case, mass violence. And so that is something that's always been there. And I think you can't look at the issue of nuclear weapons without looking at the issue of race. I don't know how you separate them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say, sort of reading both of your books, I was a bit, embarrassed that I hadn't sort of made that connection more deeply in sort of my own thoughts. But once you see it, it's hard to unsee. And so, within the pages of African Americans Against the Bomb, you effectively establish the profound sense of existential anxiety and urgency experienced by post-World War II activists, resulting from the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These activists lived when Jim Crow persisted, and they were not far removed from chattel slavery in the US, the US Civil War, etc. And then on top of that, they witnessed the internment of Japanese Americans by the US during World War II, Japanese dehumanization throughout the war, and the deployment of the most devastating weapon ever created on Japanese cities rather than German or Italian targets. How can we nurture and maintain a pervasive sense of urgency that these early activists felt once they sort of began to understand the implications of, these great world powers with these very problematic histories with race at their foundation, having possession of these weapons? How can we sort of maintain a pervasive sense of urgency in addressing the reality and challenges presented by nuclear weapons?
Yeah, so it's not easy because you cannot go into a predominantly Black community at this point and say, well, you need to get invested in this issue because it's the most existential threat of your life. It's not. Being killed by the police on the way to school or to work is. So it's meeting people where they are and understanding that piece, right? And so the other thing is education, right? Representation matters. And so how can we expect somebody who is African American, for example, to get invested in this issue if when they look at the history of this issue, they don't see themselves in it, right? That makes no sense. They need to see themselves. So when my students see Malcolm X and Lorraine Hansberry and Coretta Scott King and Langston Hughes and so many others care about this issue and be invested in this issue, then they say, here's somebody that looks like me and shares this common ancestry with me, and they were invested in this, and they see where they're part of this, so now I need to be part of it. The other piece, again, is making it plain. And I come back to that phrase because that was something that Malcolm X used to always say, right? Malcolm X had that rare ability to go into Oxford and debate the best minds in the world, which he did, but he could also reach that boy on the block. And he knew he didn't need the fancy language to do that, right? That is that, making it plain phrase he would use. And I think, Tupac Shakur is the only other person I've really seen with that ability to do so. And so it's making it so that you can talk to people and relate to them through music and through art and through sports and all these different ways and show them how these things are connected, so that they can get involved. And then lastly is giving them agency. So it's one thing for them to be educated about this or care about this, but then it becomes, what can they do about it? And so it's giving them something tangible that they can actually do about this issue, so they feel like they're doing something that can change this. So all of those things are essential, to kind of show the urgency. And one thing I kind of get a lot of times is, well, it's different today because there's so many issues going on with young folks, especially today. And I get that. My students will say, hey, I'm taking 15 credit hours and I'm trying to pay off student loans, and I'm working 2 jobs and sending money back to my family, and trying not to get killed by the police on the way to school. And, oh, by the way, you want me to stop nuclear war? Like, let me know when I have time for that. Like, I get it, right? But even if you look back in the 1980s, again, at the kind of golden era of this, these issues were still there for them. There was rampant police brutality, there was abject poverty, there was a war on drugs, there was an AIDS epidemic, right? And a lot of groups just said, okay, we get it, but what does it matter if we achieve this social justice if we're all dead from nuclear war? Like, this doesn't, we see how these things are connected. And so they just kind of switched lanes. And so it's showing them, again, it's how do you educate groups, and then how do you actually explain, this is what you can do. And, it's part of the work that I, consistently do. But we also need to recognize that within the disarmament movement, within the arms control movement, it has been dominated for so long by, white men and older white men. And so it's, looking at these organizations and saying, okay, how do we break that down? How do we break through that? Because that's not going to help anybody. We need to look at new voices. We need to bring new voices in. We need to encourage new voices. So how do we go about doing that? And that, again, is something that I'm consistently working with groups on and trying to do.
Yeah, and that connection that you mentioned is so important in terms of helping people to understand how interconnected these various freedom movements and civil rights movements were. Um, so obviously with African Americans Against the Bomb, the book is meant to be situated within a comprehensive narrative that challenges the perception of the Black freedom struggle as a singular movement confined to a specific period. What makes this broader narrative so crucial, yet so underappreciated in the present day?
Yeah, because what we tend to do is we want to, especially when it comes to African American history, we want to kind of separate it from the rest of the world, separate it from U.S. history, as its own thing. We also, what we want to do is, you open up those books and it's everything is in their nice, neat, categorical little boxes, right? So there's Dr. King. We want to preserve him on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. It's I Have a Dream, and that covers him. Or Rosa Parks just did one thing, and that covers her. We're starting to see now, with the rebellious life of Miss Rosa Parks, we're starting to see different things come out. And so one thing is, like, for example, with Lorraine Hansberry, we kind of want to box Lorraine Hansberry in with A Raisin in the Sun, but she was so much more than that. And we've seen a couple new books now come out recently that have shed light on that. And so, which I'm grateful for, because, yes, she had a raisin in the sun, but she was a feminist and a socialist and an anti-nuclear activist. And in fact, the last play that she ever wrote was about a nuclear holocaust and what happened to those survivors. And she learned a lot of that from Jimmy Baldwin. Jimmy Baldwin was part of SANE, and James Baldwin was an anti-nuclear activist, or, again, Langston Hughes or Du Bois. And so we do a disservice when we kind of want to compartmentalize these people and just reduce them to one thing, instead of looking at how well-rounded and then how these things are all interconnected. That, again, so especially when we look at the colonialism issue and how what was happening in Ghana, or what was happening, in Nigeria, or what was happening in Kenya and like South Africa, and how these things are connected then to what was happening in the United States. And when you go through the Black press, and when you go through people's papers, and when you go through their, all of these kind of things, you start to realize that this was always on their radar, that these were connected issues. We just, what happens is those that write about nuclear issues have tended to go one way and not really look at the issue of race for so long. I mean, and then others that are writing, say, biographies on Bayard Rustin or biographies on King, they never touch this issue. So when I came to it, the good news for me was that nobody had ever touched this issue. Great, it's going to be original. The bad news is nobody had ever touched this issue. So where do I begin, right? Because again, both sides were saying that when I would go to the nuclear side, the disarmament side would say, you're crazy. I never saw a Black person at a rally. And then I would go into, look in the civil rights stuff in the Black freedom movement, and they'd be like, you're crazy. They didn't care about this issue. They were trying to end desegregation and, Plessy and Jim Crow. And then when I started, again, finding all this stuff, it was like, no, there's a lot here. It just has never been talked about. And I'm grateful that since then, the first book came out in 2015, we have kind of seen a lot now more being written about and a lot more attention being paid to the intersection of race and nuclear weapons, which is, I welcome that in every way. Still so much more work to do. Like my new focus now is looking, my next project is looking specifically at Africa and the role of Africa and the bomb, because there's so much there. So yeah, I'm grateful that it's out there, but it's, for a long time, it was just, everything was very, very siloed. And that's a big problem, because we do that in education as well, right? We tell students all the time, you study humanities, you study STEM, and never shall the two meet. And that's so ridiculous to me, right? Because if somebody is studying physics, they should be taking classes on history and humanities and philosophy and ethics and things like that, and vice versa. And so the siloing in our organizing, the siloing in our education is a huge problem that we need to really break down.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Sort of as you talked about the different sort of civil rights icons that, spoke and wrote extensively on the bomb, I was really struck by just how much I didn't know that. It almost felt a little bit like an anachronism to me, of like, I barely comprehended that this person was around and relevant at that time to register, sort of comments on the bomb. Or also play such an important and influential role in terms of, uh, you know, helping President Reagan evolve on this issue. So obviously, while extensive discourse exists on Reagan's ideological shift concerning nuclear weapons and the Soviet Union, your perspective presents a less frequently explored viewpoint: the vital role of anti-nuclear activists and advocates through direct action. Why is this connection less readily discussed, do you think?
Yeah, so thank you. So just to double back to the first point you made is, because I hear this a lot, like, why didn't I know about this? And, and I feel like I should have known about this, but how would you? If it's not written about, if it's not in our books, if it's not in our education system, then how would you? If everything we ever hear about Langston Hughes is only his poetry in the Harlem Renaissance, then how would you know that he was this strongly anti-nuclear activist that was, really the first one to come out and call out, President Truman's racism in this? Like, you wouldn't if it wasn't out there, right? So that's part of where that research comes in and why we need to keep, going on this path. As far as Reagan goes, Reagan gets perceived as somebody that, saw the light at some point, and that Reagan was saying, now we must never have a nuclear, we must never be fought. But no president ever acts without being pushed. Any president on either side of the aisle, nobody just acts. They're pushed. They're pushed by people in the streets. They're pushed by lobbying. They're pushed by, all sorts of things. And this is no different with Reagan. So when Reagan comes into office, he is massively expanding the nuclear arsenal. He is spending so much money on military spending. He surrounds himself with people that are all talking about a winnable nuclear war. We should have a nuclear war. It's no problem if we have a nuclear war. And so it really reignites the anti-nuclear movement that was a little bit dormant coming off the Vietnam War, just simply exhaustion and focusing on ending the war. And when you have, again, you can't ignore 1 million people in the streets. You can't ignore, it wasn't just, what you would think of as grassroots activists. It was middle-class folks. It was people from various parts of the religious community, different denominations, different races, different people from the Midwest. And you had, nurses for nuclear disarmament, architects for nuclear disarmament. It was everywhere because there was a general fear that we were going to go to war with Russia. There was going to be a nuclear exchange. And so, Reagan is pushed in this direction through multiple things. He's pushed by seeing all of these folks out in the streets. He's pushed by senators putting a nuclear freeze initiative on the ballot. He's pushed on people that are running against him, and he's also pushed by Gorbachev. Gorbachev is the person, the visionary. He's the one that really ended the Cold War, not Reagan. And so, there is this meeting where Gorbachev and Reagan meet up. And Gorbachev says flat out, I'm prepared to get rid of all nuclear weapons right here, right now. Let's do it. Let's completely disarm. And all I'm asking is that you keep this crazy Star Wars plan that Reagan had, keep the testing in the laboratory for 10 years. Don't weaponize space. And we can do this right here and right now. And of course, Reagan at the golden hour says no and walks. But we did get the INF treaty. Now, Trump and Putin got, ended that, but that was a significant treaty. It eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons, especially in Europe. So we can't dismiss that. And again, going back and looking at his pollsters and Secretary of State and looking at all these people in his administration, they were saying, yes, we were absolutely aware of what was happening. We knew we had to change course. And they tried. Maybe they should co-opt the freeze movement. Maybe they should try this. But there was no question they were aware of what was happening. And we can debate how much of a role it played, but I would argue that it absolutely played a role in moving the needle on Reagan. So I don't think Reagan should get this. If we're going to give him credit for changing his stance on nuclear weapons by the end of his second term, I don't think that we should act like he just did it on his own, that he wasn't pushed in any way, shape, or form in doing this. And that's not just from, grassroots activism, that's also from the culture. I mean, if you look at, whether it was when MTV emerged and you look at movies, or if you look at what was happening, with 3 Mile Island, if you look at what was happening and it was just all around us. There were 130 books in the first term that came out, all dealing with nuclear war, The Unforgettable Fire, The Fate of the Earth. Like it was in our culture. There was a real fear there. And I think he knew that he was going to have to do something, that it was impossible not to act.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like reading both of your books, it's so many sort of statements and sort of attitudes of some of the government officials you quote. It's such an interesting artifact because I think now we all, at least folks born after the end of the Cold War, we have this sort of complacency about the use of nuclear weapons and just this inherent trust in our elected officials. But in the past, really senior people were pretty cavalier about how they talked about nuclear weapons and threatened to use them in Korea, Vietnam. I think you really paint the portrait well of, this is a really precarious time. People didn't have the same, justified or not assurances that we have today that we're not going to wake up in a sort of post-nuclear landscape.
Yeah, I mean, if you look for a long time, it was actually the Congressional Black Caucus that was at the forefront of this in Congress, right? It was people like John Conyers and Ron Dellums, even Andy Young, who was President Carter's Secretary of State, UN ambassador. You had so many African Americans who were actually in Congress that were, pushing this. And so I think that, there is. I think that today there is this fear of what would happen and can it happen? And again, we're starting, if you look at, I think we're as close as we've been since the Cuban Missile Crisis with Russia. And so this is a time where I think we really need to be galvanizing and working on this issue, and not let this moment go by. Because, I think what happens is when after Trump and Biden came in some circles, I think there's kind of this collective exhale of like, oh, okay, it's now President Biden who's sitting in JFK's seat if we were ever faced with another Cuban Missile Crisis. So I can relax a little bit. But as you know, he's not going to be president forever. And there's a very good chance we end up with Donald Trump again, or we end up with a President DeSantis. And do we think that they would be rational actors at all when it comes to nuclear weapons? Not from the rhetoric of Donald Trump. And people had said, I remember when Trump was president, oh, at the last second, if he went over to the nuclear football in the briefcase and went to put codes in, somebody would tackle him and stop him. Nope, that's not how the system works, right? The system is designed where the president at any time can essentially end civilization. And I don't think any one person, not Obama, not Trump, not anybody, should have the ability to end life on the planet. And that's essentially what we're facing right now. So, it's educating folks that this is the process and this is where we're at right now, so that they actually want to do something and can do, and then showing them what they can do. But I also think too, it is. We just had the G7 summit in Hiroshima. And I mean, if that wasn't a clear sign that there is no intention of real actionable things happening, here were all of these world leaders and put out this, milquetoast statement and, put their wreaths on and at the park. And that was the end of it. It was just move on. And that is a really dangerous thing right now, when we look at how close we are to nuclear war. And, getting back to the idea of are people a little bit more passive today because they think there's safeguards and things of that nature. I would look at what happened in Hawaii just a couple of years ago, right? And in Hawaii, if those that are listening are not familiar, everybody that lived in Hawaii got a text message from the government that said there is an ICBM, a nuclear weapon, on the way. and that this is not a drill. And for 38 minutes, everybody who lived in Hawaii truly believed that this was the end of their life. And I know people that were there. And if you ever have done the virtual reality on an Oculus of on the morning you wake, it will actually put you there and really shows you just how frightening for 38 minutes it was that people thought this was it until they, said it was a false alarm. So, yeah, I think we're living in a very, very dangerous time right now.
Yeah. I think, folks don't fully appreciate we've only been doing this for about 80 years, living with the bomb. And I think you paint a really good portrait of the idea that, we can't continue this record of avoiding near misses, accidents, etc., for the rest of humanity. Eventually, there are going to be major mistakes that cost a lot of lives.
Yeah, and I think disarmament, the idea of mutual assured destruction or that no country would be crazy enough to use them or something like that, what Russia has shown is that with Ukraine is that's completely false, right? So you
Right.
have one thing is all it's shown us is that Russia has blackmailed the world with nuclear weapons right now. Because if they didn't have nuclear weapons, this whole thing would be done. I believe NATO would have went in and helped Ukraine more, and this would be over. But the other thing is, here is Russia saying they will not be deterred by anything that the United States does. They will not be deterred by anything NATO does. And then here's the US saying we won't be deterred by anything that Russia does. So if both sides are saying they won't be deterred, then how can you intelligently make the argument that deterrence works, right? It can't just work for one side or the other. And so, and yeah, I just think that, those are things that we're not, when we think about, oh, nobody, we're also not hardwired, I think, in the way of social media today. And what I mean by that is, when I grew up in the 1980s, without social media, there would be one major thing that would happen and we would have months to process it, essentially, right? I remember being younger and they would roll the TV, the old TV, into our classroom, and we're watching the space shuttle and it explodes and we're kind of like, oh my God, and processing that. And now you just feel like you are getting punched in the gut every minute, right? So you're trying to process Russia moving nuclear weapons into Belarus, and then you 2 seconds later there's a mass shooting in some place in the United States, and then 2 seconds later there is another repressive bill that just got passed, and you're just kind of like reeling from all of this. And so it's very easy to say, I just can't handle it. I'm not hardwired to just kind of deal with all of this, so I'm going to divorce myself from all of it. I'm going to divorce myself from all of it, and I'm just going to play video games or just, whatever, eat crappy food, watch bad TV, like whatever. And I get it. Like we all need those, we need to divorce ourselves from it in some ways. But that's what happens is we just can't wrap our heads around the idea of nuclear war, what would happen, right? And so how do you then get people to say, okay, I know this is like one of the hardest things to realize, and study, but we can stop it, and like showing them things like South Africa, where they did end their nuclear weapons program, showing them that at one point the U.S. had, 25,000 nuclear weapons, and now we're at, 12,000. Showing that the world had 76,000 nuclear weapons, and now where are we at? Showing them that we have had all these treaties, we have had success. We can have success again. It's just, now mobilizing and showing how can we actually do that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. And I think showing that trajectory and emphasizing the importance of that trajectory is really important in this work because we can't continue on in perpetuity to sort of live under the threat of nuclear weapons. It just doesn't seem like it's going to end well for humanity.
Yeah, and this is one of those issues too that it's important for folks involved in this issue or that care about this issue to realize it's not for our generation, right?
Right.
I'm a very instant gratification person. I would love to just be able to do some action and then have nuclear weapons be gone. That's not reality. The reality is when I die, I'm 48 years old. When I pass away, nuclear weapons and institutional racism are probably still both going to be on this planet, right? But I'm not doing it for me. I'm doing it for future generations. This is a marathon. This is, and so you chip away at it little by little by little. And again, it is a process. If you would have told, those that were rebelling against slave owners that there would be, in freedom that was going to come in some way, they wouldn't have believed you, maybe. if you would have told those that were facing all this repression during Jim Crow that we would have ended up with a President Obama, they would have said, it's a process and it doesn't happen
Right.
fast enough or nearly enough, but we do progress in those ways. And anytimes like we take step backwards and then we got to, and so right now it seems like we are in a really a step backward phase of the nuclear arms race. But we can move forward with the TPNW. And I think the TPNW is so important because it is a tool. It is a legally binding tool through the UN. And it shows that the majority of the world, so much of the world wants to eliminate these nuclear weapons. And it is comprehensive. And you don't need a degree in physics to understand it. And you can get your cities involved. And you can, what they did with the financial aspect, the ICANN, the group that is so influential and won the Nobel Peace Prize for this, New York ICANN was with partners was able to get the New York City pension fund to divest over $415 million from nuclear weapons making providers. That's incredible. That's a major victory. And so these are, and at one point, landmines were used all the time in war. But we passed the landmine treaty and we shamed countries that used them. And we, worked constantly to isolate those countries so that landmines are largely not used in war. The same thing with chemicals outside of a, depleted uranium or a rogue nation. And so it's the same thing that we chip away at this and we get more of the world to sign on and say, look, we're not going to work with you. We're not going to trade with you. We're not going to, do anything with you if you are possessing these weapons. We need to get away from them. And so that's what we need to, continue to chip away at. And that's why I think, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is such a good way to do that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So just one more question before we turn to audience questions. In African Americans Against the Bomb, you devote an entire chapter to analyzing the nuclear disarmament policy implemented during the Obama administration. What, in your perspective, hinders its broader recognition and discussion in contrast to his administration's record on drone strikes?
Yeah, so it's funny that one thing I always get when I was doing the book tour on that book is, oh, you're not talking about Obama's drones and you're not talking about Obama's policy on this part. And my thing was, well, because the book's not about drones, right? The book is specifically about his nuclear weapons policies. And so it was very hard because the book came out in 2015 and he was still president. And as a historian, you don't want to predict something, right, and be wrong. But I knew, obviously, with the subject matter, I was going to have to deal with that. So, when in the book, what I talk about is so President Obama, I think, did some really good things in terms of when he got the nuclear security summits together and he got loose nuclear weapons making materials out of other nations, and so that they couldn't be into safeguarded hands. I think that was really important. I think getting the New START treaty passed was really important. And I think the most important thing he did, bar none, with his presidency was the Iran nuclear deal without firing a shot and getting Iran to stop building a nuclear weapon. And symbolically, I think it was really important. And I was very appreciative that he was the first sitting president to visit Hiroshima while in office. Now, does that mean he did everything I wanted? Well, no. I think that he still signed on to the $1 trillion modernization plan, which he kind of had to because Senator Kyle had him over a barrel on that one. He did not get rid of no first use. He did not get rid of hair trigger alert. None of those things. He was still doing subcritical nuclear tests. And I mentioned all of that in the book. My point with that is he never said, yes, I can. He said, yes, we can. And so if we wanted him to do more on that front, then we should have been out in the streets making him do what he said he was going to do. And I think what happened with President Obama is, for at least a lot of progressives, is we really didn't know how to handle him, because here was, for a lot of us, the man was now the man. And so we're like, wait, we're so used to kind of going after policies and president's decisions, but the racism and the vitriol was so much on the other side against him that some of us fell into just a kind of defensive position of like, okay, we need to defend him against all of this racism and all of this, that nobody will work with him. They're blocking him on everything. He was trying to do this all on his own. So I'm not going to come out that hard against him, but I do disagree with this issue, and kind of that conundrum of what do we do? But I did have to check myself constantly with him and be like, wait, if this was George W. Bush doing this, would I be upset? Would I be out there in the streets? And I think for a lot of us, we were dealing with that. So I think Obama didn't, I think he did some really good things. I think he didn't do nearly enough. And I try to, balance that in my assessment of him. Again, he wasn't finished being president when I wrote this. And I just think that, again, we should have been much more, we should have pushed him much more. And he would admit that. he had said that he needed, he should be pushed on certain things like that. So that's kind of where I came down, but I tried to stay just on his nuclear policies and not branch out and make it an overall kind of critique of foreign policy, because that's a whole other book that's been done, and that wasn't, what I wanted to necessarily look at.
Okay, great, great. Well, let's turn to questions from the audience now, and we encourage people to keep asking questions. So the first question we're going to turn to, in the nuclear space, we often hear that the existential fear of our generation has shifted from nuclear war to climate change. Do you think there are lessons for movements working on climate change to be more inclusive? Do you see a similar erasure of people of color on climate change advocacy?
Thank you for that question. And I almost would go the opposite. I think we're seeing more inclusion in climate change than in nuclear disarmament. And I think that's obvious because, again, it's tangible and you can see what's being done to, say, Native American lands. We can see what's being done to countries that do not have the resources and have been colonized. And as a result of that colonization or neoliberal policies that we're seeing then don't have the infrastructure for climate change and things of that nature. And so, again, I understand that. And I think you could argue that these are the two biggest existential threats of our lives. Climate change takes a little bit longer. Nuclear weapons could destroy humanity in a matter of minutes. But I don't look at them as, this competition of which is worse. They're both horrific, right? So I think it would be in our interest to work together and say, okay, if we're trying to save humanity, if we're trying to, how are these things connected and what can we, do about it together? So again, I am a big proponent of intersectionality. I am a big proponent of seeing how movements are connected. And so I think that we should, definitely work together on that. I think there's lessons to be learned in terms of how climate change organized, in terms of how climate change, structured themselves in money issues, and in terms of recruitment, in terms of branding, in terms of those things, right? Again, there's this idea that nuclear disarmament, and I often, I was recently on a talk, and their whole thing was we want to get younger folks, interested in this issue and blah blah blah. And then when I went into the call, before the call started, they were playing music and it was all Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan and things like that. And I'm like, hey, I'm a Seeger fan as much as the next guy, and I love me some Bob Dylan. But if you think this is going to bring in a new generation of students or just activists, you're crazy. Like, you have to get more. So here I am focusing more on somebody like MF Doom and hip hop artists that are talking about nuclear disarmament. Here I am looking at professional athletes that are involved in this. You've got to get different ways and think creatively on doing this. Otherwise, it's still going to be branded as kind of this one thing. And that's, again, what I love about ICANN, especially when I went to, it was so different going from to Vienna last summer for ICANN and the first meeting of states parties for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It was so many young people from all over the world, all different races, all getting together and like this kind of festive, like we're doing this kind of movement. Cut to when I went to spent the month of August at the United Nations for the NPT conference or for the NTP review conference, and it was completely different. I mean, civil society was very isolated. The US denied massive amounts of visas to places like Nigeria or Iran and things of that nature. It was completely different. And so I think that is, things that we can learn from these movements, and it would be in our best interest to work together.
Yeah, yeah, great. That makes sense. So for our next audience question, do you think the June 12th, 1982 rally motivated Ronald Reagan to start his Strategic Defense Initiative on March 23rd, 1983, to render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete?
So I think, again, I don't want to say that just having 1 million people in the streets it made Reagan miraculously wake up and say, I'm going to change course. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is previously it was looked at as it did nothing, that this played no role. It's not really talked about if you look at Reagan biographies and things like that. And I would argue it did play a role and that it did move the needle and did push him to think differently. Now that in concert with Gorbachev, in concert with where the culture was and where other politicians were, where lobbyists were, where all of those things I think played a role. Star Wars is a completely different thing. I think Star Wars was this crazy idea that he had, you can date it back to, bad B movies that he was in sci-fi and things of this nature where his head was at. And so creating this giant space shield that was just going to ping weapons all over the place was crazy. Then crazy now, it has never worked. It won't work. And so I think that was just something that was his little baby that he was going, hell bent on trying to make happen. I don't think that was influenced one way or the other from a freeze initiative or from any action that was happening, as a result of the disarmament movement.
Says, okay, they used the bomb on Japan rather than Germany has nothing to do with racism. It was because Germany had surrendered before the bomb was ready for use. I guess that's more of a comment, but any
I can answer
response to
that.
that?
And I mean, yeah, sure, absolutely. Okay, so the decision to drop the bomb. There's so much in history that has just gotten wrong. In part, obviously, the obvious ones that the bomb was never to be used on, as you mentioned, on Japan. The bomb did not end the war. The bomb did not save millions of American lives. None of that. FDR put the Manhattan Project, and a lot of this is going to come out hopefully in Christopher Nolan's blockbuster Oppenheimer, which will be out in July. And so when FDR was planning the bomb project, when he launched that, when in 1938, when the two German physicists split the atom and Einstein realized what could happen, it was to stop Germany. The fear was that the Nazis and Hitler were going to get the bomb. But by April 1945, as your panelists or your audience member said, Hitler was dead and Germany was largely on the run now and defeated. And that wasn't because of the U.S. That was because of the Russians. The Russians did the yeoman's work in this war. They were the ones that really defeated the Germans, 27 million dead as a result of that. And so Truman comes in, and when Truman comes in, who was not FDR's choice, FDR would have liked Henry Wallace to continue to be vice president, but there was a coup inside the Democratic Party essentially for Truman. When Truman comes in, Truman was told from the beginning that from his Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, that if he used the bomb, that this bomb project was being created, and if he used it, civilization will be completely destroyed. And so there's no question he knew how bad it was. We also know, and I read about this in the first book, of Truman's racism. Truman was somebody that was, he in his letters to his wife, Bess, in his personal diaries, rarely ever refers to African Americans as anything other than the N-word. He admits he has race prejudice in letters to his wife, Bess. He thinks that all Black men should be in Africa. He brags in interviews that in his family used to get slaves as wedding presents to start off the housekeeping with. His mother openly supported the Confederacy and said when she first visited him at the White House, she'd rather sleep on the floor than ever step foot in Lincoln's bedroom. At one point, he sent a $10 check to the Ku Klux Klan to join, but they refused his membership because he wouldn't fire Catholic workers in one of his businesses in Missouri. If you look at his policies, especially to Puerto Rico, they're some of the most horrific things I've ever seen a president or any person do to a group of people. And so there's no question that his own deep-seated racism played a role in the decision to use the bomb. How much we don't know. It was also to flex his muscles to the Soviet Union. And it was also revenge for Pearl Harbor. Those were the reasons for it. And so, yes, it didn't need to be used on Japan because we had already cracked Japan's code. We'd intercepted their messages. Japan was already militarily defeated. We knew they were militarily defeated. If we would have changed the surrender terms to let them keep the emperor, which we do anyways, we could have ended the war even sooner. So there were multiple ways to end this war sooner. Our own U.S. War Department did an estimate that had we gone in a ground invasion based on the firebombing and island hopping that we'd already done, the estimates were really around 93,000 casualties, nowhere near the million number. So all of this has been, just generated through all sorts of bad historical stuff, whether it's books, whether it's, the internet, whether it's through, bad movies, but that's the reality. So yes, the bomb did not need to be used in Japan. That war would have ended sooner without it. And even when we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and then 3 days later on Nagasaki, the War Council in Japan voted to keep the war going, even though they thought we had 100 more in Tokyo is next. What ultimately led the Japanese to surrender was when the Red Army said they were coming into the war in the Pacific, and that's when they ultimately threw their hands up because that was who they feared the most. So yes, we were planning on using it on Germany. We did not need to. Once Germany was essentially defeated, we did not need to use this. And of course, Einstein regretted the letter he sent to Roosevelt advocating for making the bomb project his entire life, had he known that Germany was going to surrender and it wouldn't have been needed. And Truman knew all that. Truman was told repeatedly by, not peace doves, he was told by Curtis LeMay, he was told by Eisenhower, he was told repeatedly by his military that not only if you use this will all of humanity be destroyed, but also he's starting a process that we all live with today. And he knew that and he did it anyways and bragged about it his entire life, showing no remorse at all.
Wow, wow, a lot of really important context there. And I think really sort of underlines the anxiety that activists had, sort of post World War II. Where does this lead? Where does this end? Is this now the new sort of military response that the U.S. Issues anytime there's a challenge to U.S. interests? So for our next question, we have, how can we mobilize the public to get our leaders to disarm?
Um, yeah, so I don't think there's one way. There are again, me personally, I think that if we're looking for a direction to push, it would be the TPNW, and I say that because again, that is something that you can get your city councils involved in. That is something you can get your governors to sign on to. That is something that you can get your senators to sign on to, and that is ultimately something you can push the president to do. I'm not naive in that the U.S. is just miraculously going to disarm and nobody else is. Oh, well, what about Russia? What about North Korea? I get that, but as the only country to use nuclear weapons, I think we should be the example. We have enough to end the world multiple times over, and we're going to spend trillions of dollars for more nuclear weapons. That makes absolutely zero sense. So we could go down to 500. We could go down and start that process and look at, we're willing to go down if you're willing to go down and start that process instead of going the other way and going higher and higher and higher. The other thing is, what I would say is to how can we get our leaders? Well, number one is who you vote for, and I know that seems like not the most the biggest issue, the biggest way of activism, but it is important. When you have somebody like a Jamie Raskin, like an Ed Markey, like a McGovern, when you have an Ilhan Omar, when you have people like that that are willing to work on disarmament, that are fans of the TPNW or supporters, they need to know that we are their foot soldiers, that we have their back. And those that are in favor of more nuclear weapons and using them, we need to work against them in terms of voting and things of that nature. The other thing is what you personally have. Everybody on this call has a set of gifts, and what you do with it is your gift back. I often say I have no artistic ability whatsoever. I can't draw a stick figure to save my life, can't play a musical instrument. I have the ability to write, my ability to teach. It's what you choose to do with it. So if you are a writer or a poet or a sculptor or a graphic designer, or you're into video games or whatever the case may be, use that to educate. Use that for the fight of nuclear disarmament, and then you'll start to see those things chip away. And that's what they did in the 80s. That's what Dancers for Disarmament did. That's what music artists did. That's what we had that, and so we just need to get back to that. And so those are some of the things. So I always hesitate on saying you should do this because not everybody. Some people are really good with having the bullhorn and being on the front lines. Other people it's not their thing. They're really good at organizing, maybe being in the background, and so that's okay. It's just what you choose to do with it. And so and when you have that kind of collective idea going on, then you can start to see where people will collectively act and go in that direction and again chip away at it. And when we hear, well, with the TPNW, it's mostly countries from the global south and so on and so forth. But in the nuclear powers aren't part of it. We're starting to see cracks in that, right? We're starting to see Germany was an observer of the first meeting of states parties. Australia is no longer kind of trashing the TPNW. We're starting to see now more and more of like, okay, this is the direction that we can't sustain this. So it's just, again, it seems like it's not moving fast enough, and we're not seeing as much progress, but chip away at it little by little by little, and that's really all we can do.
Okay, great, great. And looks like we just have one final question here. Do you think there could be a narrative or movement coordination between defunding the police and disarmament? From your book, I know this was an argument from civil rights leaders that the money spent on weapons could be much better spent on peace domestically.
Yes, absolutely. So when you look at just whether it's police brutality, when we look at the weapons, when we look at just general militarization and the military-industrial complex, what is at the end of the day? It's violence, right? It's violence, and it's not just violence; it's a contempt for human life, and in many cases, it's a contempt specifically for Black life, right? An utter contempt of life. And so I think when we see the militarization, especially of the police and the weapons that they're getting, we're seeing they're getting it from the military. We're seeing the budgets that are going to, say, the New York City Police Department. We see the budgets that are going to the US military. The key is then how do we educate the public of where that money could be better spent? And I want to tell the story that years ago, when the first book came out, I was in Baltimore, which is not far from where I'm at in Washington, D.C. And in Baltimore, there was a couple of years ago, they were asking the parents to bring in space heaters because they had no heat for their students in public schools. And when I'm able to explain that we're going to spend $1 trillion on nuclear weapons and they don't have heat for their kids, they start to make those connections and realize where that money could be better spent, not on the police, not on, just more rearming. So when we say in the police, when we say defund the police, we're not saying you take all the money away. We're saying is the money should be better spent on psychologists and on social workers and on programs, job training programs and things like that, and de-escalation, instead of just more guns and more vests and more, all of this kind of thing. And it's the same thing here, right? So we don't have, even in terms of just how we are culturally, we do a wonderful job celebrating war, right? Just had Memorial Day, and we have war memorials all over this country, right? We don't ever talk about peace. Peace is looked at as weak. Disarmament is looked at as weak. So we don't talk about that. And when you think about, say, like the Vietnam War, we have the wall down at the mall, the National Mall, and it has the names of 58,000 men who gave up their life, who died in the Vietnam War. But nowhere in this country, and I mean nowhere, do we have the names of the 3.8 million Vietnamese that were killed in that war. And if those names were on the wall would be 10 miles long. And then maybe we would think a little bit differently about war and peace, right? So the idea that peace is this utopia that we can never achieve, or that nuclear disarmament can't happen, I don't subscribe to that. And I think, I'm not naive. I think, we're not being naive and saying it's going to happen overnight. But if you give up and you just say, okay, this is just where we're going to be, then I don't see how things can change. And we have seen change. Things have changed, but again, just not fast enough or enough. And so that's what we got to keep working on. But I absolutely do see the connections. We need to make those connections between what is happening in BLM or in the LGBTQ community or in women's rights, and then how does that translate into militarization and nuclear disarmament? And I think those, there's those things those synergies are happening as we speak.
Yeah, that's good to hear, and something to be optimistic about for the future.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, it looks like that's all of our time. Thank you, Dr. Intondi, for enlightening us, and everyone for joining us. We will be making a recording available soon. So yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Have a good one. Bye.
You too.